Prince Harry came to the view calm and prepared, but one single question from Sharon Osbourne completely destroyed him. What followed became the most disgraceful scandal in royal history that no one had ever witnessed before. The View studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy as crew members adjusted lighting and sound equipment for what was supposed to be another routine celebrity interview. The iconic table, surrounded by the show's signature colorful chairs, gleamed under the bright studio lights that had witnessed countless dramatic moments over the years. Today, however, felt different. There was an electricity in the air that suggested this interview might venture into uncharted territory. Whoopi Goldberg sat in her usual moderator position, reviewing her notes one final time. As the show's veteran anchor, she had developed an instinct for sensing when a guest appearance might spiral beyond the usual promotional boundaries. The booking had come together through multiple layers of negotiation, with Prince Harry's team insisting on specific parameters for the discussion. But Whoopi knew that once the cameras started rolling, all bets were off. Joy Behar shuffled through her preparation materials, her pen moving across her script as she highlighted particular questions. Her decades of experience in television had taught her to recognize the signs when someone was trying too hard to control a narrative. Harry's recent media appearances had become increasingly defensive, and she suspected today might be the day when that carefully maintained facade finally cracked under pressure. Sarah Haynes occupied her chair with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to navigate the show's sometimes unpredictable dynamics. She could sense the underlying tension that always accompanied high-profile royal interviews, especially given the current state of Harry's relationship with both the media and his own family. But it was Sharon Osbourne who commanded the most attention in the room. The music industry veteran and television personality had built a reputation for her unflinching directness and refusal to accept sanitized PR responses. She sat with the calm intensity of someone who had spent decades dealing with difficult personalities and inflated egos. There was something in her posture, a coiled energy, that suggested she was prepared for confrontation. At exactly 10:15 a.m., a black Range Rover with tinted windows pulled up to the ABC studios in Manhattan. Prince Harry emerged wearing a perfectly tailored navy blazer over dark jeans, his appearance striking that careful balance between royal formality and California casual that had become his signature look since relocating to America. His smile was confident, perhaps even slightly cocky, as he waved to the small crowd of photographers and fans who had gathered outside. His security detail flanked him as he walked through the building's corridors, but unlike his previous appearances on American television, there seemed to be fewer handlers, fewer layers of protection between him and potential uncomfortable questions. This confidence, or perhaps overconfidence, would prove to be his downfall. The Green Room provided a momentary sanctuary from the controlled chaos of live television production. Harry sat in a leather armchair, sipping English breakfast tea while scrolling through his phone. His latest memoir had been dominating headlines for weeks, and he had grown accustomed to the carefully choreographed interviews that had accompanied his promotional tour. This was supposed to be more of the same, friendly questions about his childhood, sympathetic discussions about his struggles, and gentle promotion of his various projects. His remaining publicist sat nearby, occasionally glancing up from her tablet to offer reassuring nods. The team had been significantly reduced since the early days of his American media blitz, partly due to budget constraints and partly because Harry had begun to believe his own press about being a master of media manipulation. This hubris would soon prove catastrophic. 5 minutes to air, a production assistant announced, and Harry felt that familiar flutter of performance anxiety mixed with anticipation. He had done dozens of these interviews by now, and had developed what he believed was a foolproof strategy: control the emotional tenor, redirect difficult questions back to his charitable work, and always maintain the position of the misunderstood victim seeking redemption. The walk from the Green Room to the studio floor felt routine, familiar. Bright lights, bustling crew members, and the quiet efficiency of professional television production created an atmosphere he had grown comfortable navigating. Multiple cameras tracked his movement as he made his way to the interview area, their operators already anticipating the kinds of shots that would work best for the various story angles that might emerge. Whoopi Goldberg stood to greet him first, her warm smile genuine but tinged with the professional wariness that came from years of interviewing controversial figures. "Harry, thank you so much for being here. We're really looking forward to this conversation." "Thank you for having me, Whoopi," he replied, his accent carrying that distinctive blend of royal precision and attempted American casualness that had become somewhat grating to British ears. It's always a pleasure to be here with such accomplished women. Joy Behar joined the greeting circle, followed by Sarah Haynes, each offering the kind of pre-interview pleasantries that were designed to put guests at ease. But when Sharon Osbourne stood to shake his hand, something in the atmosphere shifted subtly. Her grip was firm, her smile polite but not particularly warm, and her eyes carried a sharpness that suggested she was already calculating angles of attack. "Your Royal Highness," she said, though there was something in her tone that made the title sound almost mocking. "Just Harry, please," he replied, though his slight stiffening suggested he had caught the undertone in her voice. The pre-interview small talk continued for several minutes, discussions about the weather, the studio's renovations, and how lovely it was to see him again. But beneath the surface pleasantries, battle lines were already being drawn. Harry seemed relaxed, perhaps even slightly overconfident, while Sharon remained watchful, waiting for her moment. 30 seconds to live, the floor director announced, and everyone took their positions around the iconic table. Harry settled into the guest chair, crossing his legs and leaning back in a posture that projected casual confidence. His memoir sat prominently on the table in front of him, positioned at the perfect angle to catch the studio lights. The red recording lights blinked on, and suddenly they were broadcasting to millions of homes across America. "Good morning, and welcome back to The View," Whoopi began with her characteristic authority and warmth. "We're joined today by Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, who's here to discuss his powerful new memoir. Harry, welcome back to our table." "Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me," Harry replied, his smile bright and camera-ready. "It's wonderful to be here with all of you." Joy leaned forward with interest. "This book is incredibly personal, Harry. You've shared some very intimate details about your life, your family, your struggles. What made you decide that now was the right time to tell these stories?" It was exactly the kind of question he had prepared for, and Harry's response flowed smoothly. He spoke eloquently about the importance of mental health awareness, about breaking cycles of trauma, and about the healing power of sharing one's authentic truth. His answers were polished, media-trained, and designed to position him as both vulnerable and heroic. For the first 12 minutes, everything proceeded exactly as his team had planned. The questions were sympathetic, focused on his charitable work and personal growth. Harry felt himself settling into the familiar rhythm of a promotional interview, his confidence growing with each successfully navigated topic. But then Sharon Osbourne's voice cut through the comfortable atmosphere like a blade. "Harry," she said, her British accent carrying an authority that immediately commanded attention, "I have to ask you something that's been bothering me about all these interviews you've been doing." The slight edge in her tone made Harry's internal warning systems activate, though he maintained his composed exterior. "Of course, Sharon. What's on your mind?" Sharon leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his with laser focus. "You keep talking about wanting privacy, about protecting your family from media intrusion. But here you are, on television again, sharing the most intimate details of your life. Don't you see the contradiction in that?" Harry's smile became slightly more forced, but he had faced this question before and had a rehearsed response ready. "I think there's a difference between sharing your story on your own terms and having your story told by others who don't know the truth." "But that's just it," Sharon continued, her voice carrying a sharpness that cut through his prepared answer. "Whose truth are we talking about? Because I've been looking at some of the claims you've made in this book, and frankly, they don't align with what can be verified." The atmosphere in the studio shifted palpably. The other hosts exchanged glances, sensing that Sharon was taking the interview in a direction none of them had anticipated. Harry's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, but his media training kicked in. "I stand by everything I've written in that book," he said, his voice carrying a defensive edge that hadn't been there moments before. "Those are my experiences, my memories, my truth." Sharon's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Your truth again. That's a very convenient phrase, isn't it? Because it allows you to say anything you want without having to worry about whether it's actually accurate." Harry's composure was beginning to crack in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. His hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests of his chair, began to fidget with his wedding ring. "I don't appreciate the implication that I'm being dishonest," he said, his voice rising just enough to be noticeable. Sharon leaned back in her chair, studying him with the same intensity she had once used to evaluate recording artists who were trying to deceive her about their abilities. "I'm not implying anything, Harry. I'm stating it directly. Some of the stories in your book are demonstrably false. The studio fell silent except for the quiet hum of electronic equipment. Even the production crew seemed to have stopped their usual bustling to focus on the confrontation unfolding at the table. "That's a serious accusation," Harry said, his voice now carrying clear anger. "Do you have specific examples, or are you just making general attacks?" Sharon's smile was predatory. "Oh, I have examples. Let's start with your claim about being cut off financially by your father. We know from court documents that you continued to receive money from the Duchy of Cornwall well into 2020, so why present it as if you were left with nothing?" Harry's face flushed red, and for a moment he seemed genuinely speechless. When he finally found his voice, it carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "Those are private family financial matters that you couldn't possibly understand the complexity of." "Private?" Sharon's voice rose in mock surprise. "But you wrote about them in a book that you're selling to millions of people. How private can they be?" Whoopi attempted to intervene, sensing that the interview was spiraling into dangerous territory. "Sharon, maybe we should." "No, let her continue," Harry interrupted, though his voice suggested he was anything but confident about where this was heading. "I'm happy to address these questions." Sharon's eyes glittered with something approaching predatory satisfaction. "All right then, let's talk about your claims regarding your brother and sister-in-law. You've painted them as cold and calculating, but we have years of photographic evidence showing them being warm and welcoming to you and Meghan. So which version should we believe, the photos we can see, or the stories you're telling now?" Harry's breathing had become noticeably more shallow, and his voice cracked slightly as he responded. "Cameras can lie just as much as people can. What happens behind closed doors is different from what you see in public." "But that's just it," Sharon pressed, her voice relentless now. "You're asking us to take your word over documented evidence. You're asking us to believe that everyone else in your family is lying, and only you are telling the truth. Don't you think that's a bit convenient?" Something inside Harry snapped. His careful composure completely abandoned him as he leaned forward aggressively. "You don't know what you're talking about. You weren't there. You don't know what I went through." Sharon didn't flinch at his aggressive posture. If anything, his emotional response seemed to energize her. "You're right, I wasn't there. But neither were the millions of people you're asking to buy your book and believe your version of events. So why should they trust someone who seems to change his story depending on the audience?" Harry's eyes filled with tears of rage and humiliation. "Because it's the truth. Because I lived it. Because I was there." "But which truth, Harry?" Sharon's voice was now cutting and merciless. "The truth you told in 2017 about how much you loved your family? The truth you told in 2019 about wanting to continue serving? Or this new truth about how terrible everything was? Which version of Harry should we believe?" The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Harry sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words that wouldn't come. Tears were now flowing freely down his cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure humiliation and rage. He began, then stopped. "You're twisting my words. You're taking things out of context." Sharon leaned back in her chair with the satisfaction of someone who had just delivered a killing blow. "I'm not twisting anything, Harry. I'm simply pointing out the inconsistencies in your own statements. If that feels like an attack, maybe you should ask yourself why." Harry stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the studio floor with a harsh sound that echoed through the suddenly silent space. His face was streaked with tears, and his carefully styled hair was now disheveled from his frequent nervous gestures. "This interview is over," he declared, his voice breaking on the words. "I came here expecting a respectful conversation, not an ambush." Sharon remained seated, looking up at him with an expression of calm satisfaction. "The truth isn't an ambush, Harry. It's just the truth." "Your truth," he shouted, his composure completely shattered. "This is your truth, not mine. You're twisting everything to fit your narrative." "My narrative?" Sharon's voice carried genuine surprise. "I'm not the one who wrote a book full of contradictory claims and is now angry that someone noticed." Harry grabbed his copy of the memoir from the table, clutching it against his chest like a shield. "You people never change. You invite us here, you pretend to be fair, and then you attack us when we're most vulnerable." "Vulnerable?" Sharon's laugh was harsh. "You're a grown man who chose to air his family's dirty laundry for money. That's not vulnerability, that's exploitation." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, then turned toward the exit with jerky, uncoordinated movements. "I'm done with this. I'm done with all of you." As he reached the edge of the stage area, Sharon delivered her final, devastating blow. "Harry," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the studio. "The next time you want to play the victim, make sure your story stays consistent. Otherwise, people might start to think you're just another privileged man who can't handle being held accountable for his choices." Harry stopped dead in his tracks, his shoulders shaking with barely contained rage and humiliation. For a moment, it looked like he might turn around and physically confront her. Instead, he pressed his hand to his mouth to stifle what sounded like a sob, then ran toward the exit, his footsteps echoing frantically against the studio floor. The cameras followed him until he disappeared through the stage door, leaving behind a silence so complete that even the audience seemed to have stopped breathing. For several long moments, nobody moved. The four hosts sat frozen around the table, each processing what had just occurred in their own way. Finally, Sharon broke the silence with a satisfied sigh. "Well," she said, smoothing down her hair, "I suppose we know where his breaking point is." Whoopi looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Sharon, that was intense." "It was necessary," Sharon replied, her voice carrying no hint of regret. "Someone needed to call him out on his contradictions. If he can't handle basic questions about the accuracy of his own book, maybe he shouldn't have written it." Joy Behar, ever the professional, attempted to restore some normalcy to the situation. "When we come back, we'll be discussing the latest developments in the entertainment industry." But everyone knew that nothing could follow what they had just witnessed. The rest of the show would be anticlimactic, a footnote to a moment that would be replayed and analyzed for months to come. As the cameras cut away for commercial, the four women sat in contemplative silence. They had all witnessed career-defining moments before, but this felt different. This felt like the complete dismantling of a carefully constructed public persona in real time. Meanwhile, somewhere in the ABC building, Prince Harry was probably locked in a bathroom, trying to compose himself enough to face the inevitable photographers waiting outside. His remaining handlers were likely fielding frantic phone calls and attempting to craft some kind of damage control strategy. But the damage was done. In less than 20 minutes, Sharon Osbourne had systematically destroyed years of carefully managed public relations work. She had exposed the fundamental contradictions in his narrative, questioned his credibility, and reduced him to tears on live television. Whether you agreed with her methods or not, one thing was undeniable: she had asked the questions that needed to be asked, and his response, or lack thereof, had revealed more about his character than any prepared statement ever could. The truth, as Sharon had noted, was indeed just the truth. And sometimes, the most revealing truth was found not in what people claimed about themselves, but in how they reacted when those claims were systematically challenged by someone who refused to be intimidated by titles or celebrity status. In those 20 minutes, America had witnessed the complete deconstruction of a modern royal's carefully crafted victim narrative. And the architect of that deconstruction had been a fearless woman who understood that accountability doesn't recognize privilege.